Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special episode of All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani. I'm the chair of the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution. And I have with me my colleague Pranay Kotasthane, who chairs our high-tech geopolitics program. And today what we're going to talk about is a little bit at the intersection of Indo-Pacific and high-tech geopolitics, and a little bit more than that. Um, we're going to be talking about rare earths. Obviously, over the last year more so, we've heard a lot more about rare earths. We've heard a lot more about Chinese dominance in the rare earths supply chain, and the Chinese weaponization of that dominance in the rare earth supply chain, to the extent that most people believe that in this contestation between the US and China, Donald Trump blinked because of the Chinese use of rare earths and export controls on rare earths. So we're going to try and unpack all of that and also try and understand what the impact is from the Indian perspective. And we're going to try and understand from Pranay why he thinks that this rare earths dominance that the Chinese have today is not necessarily a silver bullet, ace in the cards, for global dominance. It's probably a short-term phenomenon. So Pranay, firstly, welcome to the conversation.
Hello, Chairman Kewalramani.
So,
Good to be here.
so let me begin with that, right? Tell me, what exactly is rare earths? What does it contain, and why is this so relevant from a future economies and geostrategic competition perspective?
Right. Okay, so before coming to rare earth, I'll tell you a story about how many elements in the world were important at one point of time, and gradually people thought if you don't get them, you will not be able to do things, but things change. So, for example, rubber was really important. It was used everywhere, natural rubber at one point of time before the Second World War. It was used in defense equipment, it was used in a bunch of everyday industries as well. And if you recall, natural rubber, most of it used to come from Southeast Asia, and Japan occupied Southeast Asia, and the entire supply of natural rubber to the West went away in a few months. So you had to find out alternative. Then there was this technology called synthetic rubber, which was there, but again, why will anyone invest money in it? Because natural rubber is abundantly available. But when this happened, suddenly there was focus, energy spent on getting synthetic rubber scaled up. And by the Second World War, when it ended, synthetic rubber was everywhere, and thereafter we never heard of rubber as a strategic vulnerability, right? So, I mean, and now you can make synthetic rubber from many things. So, anyways, this is a story which I just want to link it to when we bring to rare earths. So, rare earths, similarly, the word rare actually means it is a 19th century term to mean extraordinary or splendid, not in the sense of something which is not found. In fact, rare earths are more abundant than gold and platinum, silver, etc. So they are a group of 17 elements. And they are quite abundantly found across the earth, and they generally co-occur with each other. So the real challenge is, how do you separate them out? How do you separate them out in an economical way and things like that? So this is what rare earths are, and why are they used? Because many of these elements, like all the elements of the periodic table, they will have some specific properties which make them usable in a particular context. So rare earths largely are used for making magnets, making specific alloys, making specific catalysts, things like that. So currently, when we talk about rare earths, a large amount of talk has been in terms of magnets, because all our electric vehicles now, the vehicles no longer use the internal combustion engine. They are using an electric motor. Electric motors require a permanent magnet. So we have a electric motor called permanent magnet synchronous motor, PMSM. There are other motors also, but this one, you need really strong magnets, and those magnets which are made using rare earths are generally stronger and lighter.
Okay.
So there are other motors which will you can still drive an EV. There are many EVs which are being made. In fact, for example, Tesla is saying that the next generation of EVs, which they are going to launch this quarter, is going to be completely rare earth free.
Okay.
So these kinds of things are happening, but generally many of them will still use. So this is one application. These magnets can be used in many things, anywhere where you need a motor, essentially. So even on basic things, not just the EV drivetrain, even on things like your wipers in the cars, you need it. In defense, you need it for fin actuators in your missiles and things like that. So it's just like any element which will be used widely wherever there is an electric motor required, because it will be faster, more efficient. So that's the current context, and they are used for certain alloys as well. Again, they'll have specific properties which can make something lighter, something more efficient, and that's what the rare earths are. They're used in small quantities and generally combined with other elements to achieve particular properties.
Okay, so that's, I think, that's a great, palette cleanser where we understand at least what the technology is, what the material is, what are the different uses, and also why they matter for the global economy, for different sectors. The question that I think everybody's been asking is, and I think there's been lots of conversation on this on social media and even in strategic affairs circles, that in some ways the belief is that the Chinese were playing a long game. Deng Xiaoping long ago said that we have rare earths, and this was a strategic sector which was cultivated, where dominance has been systematically developed, and now you are using that dominance, weaponizing it to try and extract political concessions as part of, obviously, exactly what the US is doing to China, which is using dominance across certain categories to try and extract political concessions, and to try and sort of, if not extract political concessions, stymie the other in terms of their rights, or coerce them to agree with whatever your propositions may be. So it's part of this sort of game between the US and China. Like, can you talk to us a little bit about what's the nature of China's dominance across the supply chain of rare earths, and how difficult is it to sort of, in the immediate, to compete with the Chinese when they do something like this, where they apply export controls and they pause effectively the supply of rare earths?
Right. So I will try by saying what rare earths are not like, right? So rare earths are, one, they are not like oil, because oil, if tomorrow you don't get oil, your economy will stop, right? You will have amazing amounts of trouble. If rare earths stop, you can stockpile them, right? Because if you oil, you can only stockpile for 8-9 days. You have strategic petroleum reserves, but rare earths, because they are required in smaller quantities, they are usually merged, you can have longer stockpiles, and over time you can develop alternatives. So and it's not as if every time you use a car, your oil gets burnt up, right? Rare earths are not getting burnt up, you can recover them as well. In fact, rare earths, when you recycle them from our hard disk drives, the concentration of neodymium or magnets is more than what you find in the earth, because their concentrated forms are already existing. So that's one form. Rare earths are also not like the kind of restrictions US has put on China, like on EUV machines that ASML makes. Because China has been trying to make EUV machines for a long time, but it came to be because of huge amount of technological investment and human capital, which is difficult to create elsewhere. So you can't suddenly create another EUV machine, despite all the efforts that everyone in the world is trying. No one wants one company to just have the profits. So that's one. They are somewhere in between, right? The rare earths, as we saw, they are used in many other places. And the world over this time was really happy that someone else is supplying, because the technology for extraction of rare earth developed largely in the West, in the US, and in California, etc. There are mountain pass, there are mines where it was developed. But this is an environmentally costly process. So over time, the interest in the West to do this waned away. And it was not as if these rare earths had the kind of application that we just spoke of. The EVs didn't exist then. So what happened is, I don't think it was like thought of at that point of time that this will EVs will come. I mean, if Deng Xiaoping could see EVs coming, I mean, then we should just scout out to him. Right? But so obviously, but China did have sources of it in Inner Mongolia. There is a Bayanobu mine, etc. So they did mine it. and then they started doing the refining. So a lot of this technology is quite basic. So there is smelting, so you need to separate it. So there will be some process to separate it. After separation, you will need some more chemical processes. It is generally acid leaching, which again is environmentally polluting, etc. So these are basic processes. There are lots of steps in it. So over time, China, because there was the mineral resources found, they could easily do this because environmental issues were not that big a priority. They did develop a comparative specialization in it. So now they are really good at it. So now we say around 70% of the rare earth production, the extraction, the first stage, is from China. There are other sources also. Vietnam has a large amount of sources. India has light rare earths. Brazil has. There are others, but China has 70%. But their dominance is in the second stage, which is really the processing stage, which is, as I was telling you, once you separate it out and you have concentrates and you do acid leaching, blah, blah, blah. So there are some sequence of steps. None of them are technically, not, it is not difficult for other countries to replicate it, but no one wanted to do this, right? So China was doing that. So that's the second step. And then there are also people who try to recycle it, like I was telling you, from hard disk drives and others. So this is how the technology stack is. And China developed significant capabilities in this segment, and others didn't want to do it because China was a very reliable supplier, right? So it was one, reliable supplier. So why do you take the risk? And second, there was also this element that overproduction and overcapacity, which we've always talked about. That was also something weighing on the investors' mind in other countries. That today we are going to invest in a mine which will take 16 years to start producing, or if we are doing a processing plant, which will take much smaller amount of time. But what if China is going to supply it at much cheaper prices, which is always the case in segment after segment. So everyone was like, you have a reliable supplier. This is a basic element. Why even get into this? So the consequence of this was not just in rare earth, in many other things that we see, we are very happily dependent on one country, which was a reliable supplier until some things changed.
So that's the key phrase that you use, right? Reliable supplier. And that's what seems to today be shifting, at least in terms of discourse. Whether that is shifted in terms of how other countries enact policies is something that we can talk about. But it's not like this is the first time that China has leveraged rare earths for a political end, right? In the first decade of the 2000s, they did it against Japan. That led to Japan de-risking in some way, but not the rest of the world. Right? Most markets didn't de-risk, although I think the overall scale of Chinese dominance in terms of global supply fell from some 80-85% to 70% currently, right? At least in the large thing. So I think how pivotal is this moment in that sense? Because questions of reliability came back then also. Repeatedly, year after year, I think whenever there were frictions with different countries, we've heard Chinese commentators and media talk about rare earths being weaponized and the potential for rare earths to be weaponized. But over the last, I would say probably since August 2022, which is when the gallium germanium, controls came into being, we've been seeing this sort of progressive steps. And in this year, we saw not just in the middle of the year, after the Liberation Day tariffs that the Americans imposed, you saw a Chinese reaction. And then in October, you saw this complete set of export controls across a range of categories beyond just rare earths also, right? Even lithium-ion batteries and even extra-jurisdictional application of some of these controls. Is that something which is where you think that the mindset is now likely to just shift around the world? Or the fact that we now have a 1-year truce between the US and China, which will mean that the incentive to invest will continue to go down?
Yeah, so I mean, we should look at the market and based on what it is. And so I'll give you some instances. The 2010 things which after the Senkaku Island dispute, which China had imposed, were different in the sense that it was very ad hoc. China never admitted to it. So some people even contest whether they had stopped it or not. But what happened because of that, the threat was felt by Japanese firms. So Japanese firms' overall consumption of rare earths since then has decreased by half, even though they are producing a lot more, which means they have done efficiency improvements where you needed milligrams of rare earths, you need micrograms, things like that. Then they have done things on urban mining, recycling, and all also. So there are a lot of things which Japan has done. An important point here is when we say people need to move away from China, there's a you don't need to completely move away. You just we don't need to think of it as the strategic leverage is not linear depending on the dependence. So, for example, 90% dependence on China is significantly a leverage, whereas 60% dependence on China is not a leverage. Because there are other suppliers. If the suppliers already exist, ramping up more processing is not that big a deal. It's not as if you're starting a mine now, right? You really need to just put more processing money, etc. onto it. So that is one thing. So we don't need to hit 20%. I think less than 50% would be sort of a really good number to aim. And then you have leverage. In fact, you don't want to buy zero things from China because buyers also have a big leverage. So that's what we want to aim for, right? So if we look at it from that lens, what has changed now? Back then it was ad hoc, now it is not ad hoc. China has made it clear under MOFCOM, as you know better than me, there is a structure put in place last year when the previous truce happened, and that structure is going to be permanent. So everyone in the world, forget the governments, every company in the world knows that the next time something happens between US, China, India, China, or any of the disputes China is involved in, they're going to use this. It's guaranteed. They have themselves demonstrated it twice. So it is a boardroom conversation. It is no longer a conversation in governments. If you want a reliable supply, you need to have alternatives. That's just clear, right? So that is one very significant difference compared to last time. And then I would look at what are countries and companies doing. Like just yesterday, there was this announcement by in the US, there is a rare earth magnet company which a retired Navy officer has formed, Vulcan Elements. The Pentagon has put money into it. So they'll supply 10,000 tons for it. Previously, MP Materials, which was a firm, again, it is a rare earth miner, extractor, refiner. So for that, again, US Department of Defense bought another 15% equity and has given a long-term purchasing contract to tackle the second problem which we discussed earlier. Chinese companies would just flood in with overcapacity. How will you tackle it? So the deal is that they have said for 10 years they have given a procurement contract with a price floor. So even if the prices of Chinese rare earths will be lesser than this price floor, the US government is still going to procure from that. So this is a big deal. And the third deal is again Elements, I think another company which is into the recycling space. There again the government has brought in stakes, the US. So these things didn't happen earlier, they are happening now. This is just the US. Now a lot of other things are happening on the bilateral, multilateral level as well. US and Australia have signed a deal. US, Japan have signed a deal. When Trump was in South Korea, Vietnam and Cambodia, Indonesia, all of them have some reserves. They have signed separate deals with the US. So all of this is happening now at the government level. At the company level, every company knows you have to develop an alternative. And the third, which is the most interesting thing, is the world is trying to move away from rare earths completely because there is an environmental cost to it, and generally companies don't want to be dependent on one country or a few suppliers. So like I told you about Tesla moving away from it, Indian two-wheeler suppliers have said, Ola has announced it's next quarter, the two-wheeler which is going to come is going to be free of rare earths. Others have said that either has said they are going to move to rare earths like neodymium, which are more abundantly found even in India. So the risk will not be that high, even if you get an alternate 30% supply or not. So these things are happening now. It is a boardroom conversation. Companies know that costs are going to increase. You have to absorb that cost, because if you don't absorb cost now, tomorrow China will block and again you will be in this situation. That's why I think it's a significant change.
So two questions emerged from that. One is around India. So I was also reading. So let me just summarize some of firstly before I get to that. Some of the points that you made. One is that it's a boardroom conversation, no longer a government conversation. It is understood that if you want reliability, you will need to diversify. And diversification is not just about being able to create capacity within your country, but also elsewhere that you can have trusted access to. but it also means moving away to different elements, different types of inputs, and all of that will mean that there will be a cost expansion. And that is something that you have to absorb if you want to be able to maintain continuity in your business, and you don't want to be left at the whims of sort of political winds changing. From an Indian point of view, when the April rare earth magnets restrictions came into being, we heard, Indian companies wanting to travel to China, their travel being delayed. Eventually, a delegation went, and nothing really materialized. Indian companies were told to apply. They reached out to the government. The Indian government said, "Look, we'll facilitate, but it's your problem. You need to figure it out." Um, at the end of the day, one of the things that the Chinese tried to do with the kind of approvals that they were issuing was try to limit purchase quantity, to set a quota, to essentially prevent stockpiling. So two things come to mind. First is, if you were a company today, how, and if you can't really stockpile, and let's say you have to do the rest of it, diversify, look for alternatives, what's the time scale that you're looking at to be able to reach the point of, let's say, okay, I'm reasonably risk diverse. I have about, let's say, 50%, coming from somewhere else. Also, what's the kind of cost that you are anticipating? Because I was reading yesterday that the Indian government is also thinking about the ANRF investing in new alternatives to rare earths and things like that. What's the time scale for this, and what's the kind of cost implication, not just for companies but for consumers also?
Yeah. See, processing, again, we have to look at the supply chain stages. So, mining will take a lot more time. So, as in, if you want to start a new mine,
Yeah.
that is not so much of a problem for India because most of India's rare earths are found in monazite beach sands.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it will take some time to develop, but it's not that you have to do a new extraction from a place where you have to bring down forests and all that. That doesn't exist. So, that will probably be shorter, maybe I would say within a decade. If you want to start something new, okay, but this will say 5 years.
Yeah.
Okay, then the processing part is not difficult at all. Like, I mean, if you can, like the Vulcan Elements thing, it's a startup.
Yeah.
It's a startup by a retired Navy guy which has gotten money from the government, and they just need to bring those machines and start doing this. So I would say that kind of thing can happen within a year.
Okay.
Recycling, the technology is still evolving because you also need to collect, you need to have a mechanism for collection of e-waste, and e-waste also has some minor gold, silver, so people actually use the e-waste for that rather than rare earths. So we'll need to have some policy mechanism to incentivize extraction of rare earth than others. But assume that happens, then again that probably is another one year game. Okay. So this is how I would look at it, that within a year you can do lots of these things. Until that time you will need to have some stockpiles, arrange it, and it's not as if China is going to stop this because their suppliers also have to live there. So this is how it is sort of mapped out. Costs I don't have a good idea about, but it's none of this tech is like EUV machine kind. So I wouldn't put like EUV machine is $200 million a piece. So it's not of that range at all. It will be significant orders of magnitude lesser. And it's not as if companies only have to do this. That's why governments elsewhere are also pitching into this, right? There is also the mineral security partnership, which I did mention. There are 32 projects going on where some are mining, some are processing, some are recycling, in which 14 countries are involved, including US, India. So that is also happening. Coming to your question on why Indian companies, none of the companies I think anticipated that China will use this, right?
Which is surprising to me because every message out there told you this is going to happen.
Yeah. So again, I think it was reliable supplier, it won't happen. That was the mistaken assumption. And to be fair, I think China also assumed the same thing with respect to chips from the US, right? That, I mean, why would you stop some chips from coming to us? They are GPUs. I mean, they used to be used in graphics cards also, but they have been restricted. So the entire world thought that the supply chains won't be broken. We are intertwined. So everyone went all in, and that's not the world we are in now. Right? So, and when the companies realize that, oh, we've not prepared, the first reaction of companies across the world was, let us secure some approval so that we at least have some supplies. But given what China has done now, they know this is going to happen again. And I think the key price I would be tracking is how are prices going to rise, because price rise is important in the market. Once price rise happens, many of these other plants which were economically unviable do become viable. And we had looked at gallium germanium also, that happened. Initially there were shock, we are not prepared, but then gallium and germanium, others started doing that, and the prices rose. Once prices rose, other suppliers who were economically unviable came into the market. So that is what you will see here as well.
So politically, if you think of, and we had this conversation earlier in the week, also last week, in fact, where from a business point of view, there are two things that come to my mind. Again, my engagement with business is not so much in India, but in Europe, is that there is a resistance, and the view is, look, we understand that you're telling us that we live in this new geopolitical world where strategic competition is par for the course and supply chains will get disrupted. You might have regional, you might have indigenous supply chains, all of that. But this is not great. We don't want this. So why don't you politicians figure out your political squabbles and let business continue? And that often means, and Beijing uses that community of businesses within other parts of the world to its advantage, right? You tell your governments to sort of ease up on some of these things. At least in Europe, I didn't get a sense that there was a deep understanding across the system, because there was also anxiety that the more you partner with government, whether it is like in the US case, government buying equity in certain entities, or government saying, like Trump telling Japan that, you're going to be bringing $500 billion, you will invest them where I want you to invest them. So the idea that government will have a bigger role in business decisions is something that is deeply resisted. That sort of gives me pause for thought. I don't know what the thing is, what the situation in India is. So, what are Indian businesses thinking about this? Also, are Indian businesses ready to cough up the cost of R&D for some of these things? Because private R&D expenditure in India is very, very low. So on those two bits, whether Indian businesses view this as sort out your political squabbles so that we can keep doing business, or do they view this as, this is the reality, I must invest, and therefore I must get over my inertia of not having R&D investment like I used to not have?
Yeah. I think most of the Indian companies would not want to do R&D. Again, it's this won't change their behavior. But we have to again look at it will be a bell curve, right? Some couple of companies would want to do this. Couple of other companies which were metallurgical firms which were not in the play now come into the play, right? India has a long tradition of metallurgical engineering, so they have been working on these areas. But again, like, why? Who wants to start a company and do all that when China was supplying it at a low cost? It was not quote unquote really strategic thing. Now it is strategic. There is if you start a rare company now, you will be like some big shot, right? That's an example which just came out last week, where Bark has given some technology to a private company, co-produced, called Ashwini Magnets, and they were into the magnet industry, ferrite core magnets, but now they have a technology to do the processing of rare earths, and they say their current plant can meet India's 25% capacity. Okay. So that's one big change and this kind of thing it exists. It's not even into the future. And maybe others will also develop and we'll get 100% from others. So that is one. Most of the companies I think will be looking at is, you need to diversify, right? Because that is really something they don't need to be convinced about now. So one, stockpile. Second, diversify. See who are the other suppliers of these, whether it is Japanese, whether it is others, that doesn't matter, right? So that every company I think will be doing. Some of the OEMs which are finally using the motors, they will look at how can you move away from rare earths completely. And again, there will be one segment of the companies which will really want to go. And once that technology gets developed, others will then figure out ways to do that. And the good thing is, it's Indian market is not dissociated with the world market. So these trends, if they are happening elsewhere, if Tesla does so. For example, Tesla earlier used to use a different kind of battery. Now, I'm not talking rare earth, but just as an example. It used to use a specific type of battery in which nickel, cobalt, and all those. They are also found. They're difficult to find. Only few countries have it, etc. Then it moved to something called LFP batteries, which uses lithium with iron, etc. Iron is more abundantly found. Once Tesla said that, lot of companies started following that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because this is new. A big producer
Yeah.
has the demand, many suppliers come in, then the market gets created.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing is already happening in other
Yeah.
places. So the Indian market will follow what others are doing in that sense also.
Yeah.
So that's my reading.
So there is an opportunity for some big Indian auto company to set the trend by trying to shift and then incentivizing the market across the board also in India. If they do that, then that can create.
Or it can be just a magnet company. Or it can just be a rare earth company. It doesn't need to be an OEM.
Yeah. Okay. So the final bit that I want to talk to you about is from the politician's point of view. Coercion by an adversary is as much about cost that you're imposing, but it's also cost that the other side may be unwilling to bear. Right? So you can impose enormous cost, but if I am prepared to bear that cost, eat grass, it's fine. It doesn't matter as much. Coercion becomes blunt in some ways. From the point of view of the Indian leadership, do you think that there is this desire now to blunt coercion, and therefore incentivize a range of different actions to be able to? I mean, firstly, is there a recognition that this coercion is very, very possible? Because we've seen this in many domains, not just rare earths, but also fertilizers, tunnel boring machines, other things. And we're likely to continue seeing this, not necessarily even as structured as the export controls that were placed. So, is there this realization in your sense across the political class, across the bureaucracy, that this is the path for the course going forward, and if we want to not be coerced, we need to invest? And secondly, if you were in those shoes of a policymaker, what are the 2-3 things that you would do, let's say just in the rare earths category, to try and build resilience?
Yeah, so we'll go by revealed actions, not by intentions, right? So what are the revealed actions? One, even before the current round of restrictions, India finally opened rare earth mining extraction from monazite sands to private players.
Yeah.
It was not allowed earlier because monazite sands also have thorium, and we thought the main object of those sands is to extract thorium for a 3-stage nuclear cycle. So it was completely closed.
Yeah.
Only one government company called IREL was allowed. So first, the fact that it has opened obviously means that there was this recognition that you need to do something in that space.
Yeah.
Second, the government had this National Critical Mineral Mission which was announced. Again, this is a 7,500 crore outlay which was announced for people to do critical mining, extraction, recycling, processing, all through the supply stages. Specifically for recycling, there's another 1,500 crores announced. So to me, it says that yes, they recognize it, because otherwise, as you know, like announcing big outlays and suddenly increasing defense expenditure, it doesn't happen. Or health expenditure. But the fact that they have these announcements means that there is at least recognition that we need to do something in this segment. What I would do differently is, I think we have to look at our comparative advantage again. Like, we don't need to do mining. If Vietnam or Brazil has, they will do it because they want to. We can extract more from our monazite sands, etc. But I think the one thing where we have a comparative advantage is downstream, like two-wheelers. We are the largest exporters of two-wheelers, one of the dominant players in this segment. So and two-wheeler motors will not be as complex as four-wheeler motors. So if there is something which happens on the OEM level to replace this, then that technology becomes really powerful. So I would encourage rare earth magnet manufacturing, moving away from rare earths, that kind of investment. Second, I would actually focus on recycling, because we are a big market. We will have large amounts of laptops, HDDs, which will have the neodymium, praseodymium things which are required, right? So those things is what so my priority would be recycling rather than on the other processes, because that is our comparative advantage. No other country apart from China will have that kind of e-waste, etc. Right? So again, if we want to focus, that should be a priority rather than on the other areas.
Okay, so look at different elements and diversify the product categories, but also recycle. Those are the two sort of big takeaways. And there is a recognition, like you identified, based on reviewed actions. Okay, I said that was going to be my final question, but I have one more, which is now that you're Xi Jinping, you've fired the bullet, and now you've sort of reined it back in after a truce with the US. You know this is where the world seems to be heading. What do you do to maintain your dominance? So that, because at the end of the day, in diplomacy, what you need is, yes, coercibility, but also coercibility only lasts for a certain period of time. It can't be endless. And I'm sure that they also understand that. So you want to prolong your dominance as far as possible and delay as far as possible resilience from others. So if you're Xi Jinping, what do you do to prolong that dominance?
See, I would say I would try to look at what is Xi Jinping doing right now. Like, see, when the first restrictions came in, it was only on certain rare earths.
Yeah.
Then they have expanded it to more rare earths and also on the processing in rare earths, on whole lot of other things, diamond wire cutting and things like that. So it's just like, really they went nuclear with it, right? They just, it to me it indicates that they don't themselves know what is that one bottleneck.
Yeah.
And so there's this, carpet bombing
Yeah.
and just saying we'll restrict everything. Let's see. Obviously, the entire world is dependent on China for something or the other. Someone will get fixed in this. So I think they are also evolving their export control strategy in this. So I think they would now be looking at which is identifying and narrowing down, because all this, if Chinese suppliers don't do overcapacity, it hurts them also.
Yeah.
So they are going to be in trouble. So maybe they will make it even more sharper.
Yeah.
Identify which are the things which others will not have. I don't think rare earths are, because I've always said that only one country can create China plus one, that is China.
Yeah.
And with all these, it is doing. But if I were Xi Jinping, probably then I would evolve to what are those narrow kind of things which only China can do and others can't. I am not able to find those, because all of these which China does can be found elsewhere. I mean, in the material space. But you can always cause a pain, right? Like, not the entire world is not going to suddenly diversify in all areas. So you will probably identify some other things, maybe pharma APIs, maybe this, that. So, but it just says again how China is becoming an international market failure. It is earlier it was a reliable supplier. At least that was the perception. But now everyone knows that it will use its monopoly power to harm others with no care or concern to the buyers or even to their own suppliers. So you need to be prepared. There's no other option.
Yeah, I think that's the big takeaway. I mean, for Indian businesses, for businesses around the world who may be listening, the idea that you can get some sort of a reset to the world that you were in is not going to happen. The idea that that any sort of political thaw, momentary or even long term, will necessarily mean that these challenges go away. They will not. Particularly when you place structural systems in place like export controls, they will last. They are not ad hoc measures. They will last. So this is a reality that I think boardrooms have to deal with.
I would just add one thing more Xi Jinping might do, and we should be aware, is they'll again flood this market after a point of time. They have tried this, they have done this before also. So again, after 1 year, you might say, okay, we will just now allow it at again overcapacity. That's why some of these procurement and commitments are important,
which is quite surprising, because it's the same system, it's the same approach that, say, if you think of American policy on H20 chips, that's exactly where it went, and it went from saying small yards, high fences, protect, don't necessarily conserve as much as possible, don't necessarily share as much as possible, and then under Trump, initially that continued to be the strategy until it flipped completely, and it was about flooding the market, giving the UAE, giving the Arab states also chips, telling the Chinese, hey, they're open for you also. And then the Chinese saying, we don't want them. So to disincentivize the other from building capacity. So that could be one of the strategies. Apart from maybe trying to make your export controls much more precise, it could also be just the other way around, which says, flood it, reduce the incentive, make it, kill the profitability, potential for profitability, and therefore, like you said, commitments, long-term commitments in terms of purchase and price may be necessary. Thank you so much, Pranay. Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I hope everybody's taken away at least a gist of what's happening in the world, and if you are people in the boardroom who are listening to this conversation, this is your reality. Please get used to it.
Don't get bored.
Thank you.